Welcome to John Golden Photography. I'm John, and today we are speaking about photographers and their gear. So why am I continuing the conversation regarding photographers and their gear? Well, this is a never-ending subject, so I could speak about this for a very long time. But today, I just want to cover in a little bit more depth than I have before regarding the requirements of hardware for a photographer. How important is it for the photographers to have gear? Some photographers have tons of gear, others have very little. And why would this make a difference for a photographer if they had a lot of gear or not? Sometimes I think some people are just, I call them photographer junkies. They're just going to buy every piece of gear they can find. So I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about people who buy tons of gear so that they could actually use it. So for today, I'm just going to cover 4 kinds of photography, and let's have a look at the gear that would be suitable or maybe even ideal for people in certain genres of photography. So what we're looking at today are landscape photographers. I'm going to look at portrait, headshot, lifestyle photographers. And I'm going to also consider functions, events, and wedding photographers. I know I'm generalizing quite a bit, but that's suitable for today's discussion. So let's look at the portrait, headshot, and lifestyle photographer first. I think this is possibly going to be the easier one to cover at this point, and that's why I'll start here. How important is gear to these photographers? My opinion, and it's only my opinion, is that really specialized gear is not so essential for these people. Shooting a headshot of office staff, for example, at a company, you don't need a fancy backdrop, you don't need fancy sets. You can maybe just stand in front of a door or in front of a wall or outside in their garden with a nice green background with shrubbery. So no fancy sets are needed. If we look at the camera, do we need a large format camera? I don't think so. I think even a micro four thirds camera would probably be suitable in situations like that. So what am I saying is you do not require an expensive camera to be able to take headshots. And what about your lens? Well, just generally speaking, rule of thumb, even a kit lens is adequate for taking these shots. The depth of field that you require does not have to be too shallow, so you don't need a specialized lens for that, and you don't need a large sensor on the camera either. So they are generally quite easy to work with because you're also generally going to be working with good light. In the event that you are forced to work where there is very bad light, then you might need a strobe, a flash, you might need a softbox, all depending on the requirements of your customer and what you would like to achieve. So there we see expensive equipment isn't really required for portrait shots. The only thing I didn't cover a moment ago is a tripod. A tripod is not absolutely essential for portraiture, but it can be very beneficial. There are many advantages of not having to hold onto your camera. You don't have issues such as shake, your shutter speed can be much lower, etc. So there are little benefits there. So a tripod is a benefit but not a requirement. Next, I'm considering the functions, event, wedding photographer. They could often use a camera that is used for portrait photography. In other words, a not so expensive camera with a smaller sensor. Extremely shallow depth of field is not essential, but it can be very nice. Tripod might be required for certain shots because you might be taking shots at sunset outside. There isn't very much light. You might need to take long exposures, a second or two long, and you're not going to do that handheld. And tripods, there are tripods and tripods and tripods. You can decide for yourself what your budget is, but again, rule of thumb with these things, normally a more expensive tripod tends to have more functionality and is also more sturdy and more robust in the way it's been manufactured than the cheaper ones. So if you are going the route of having to get yourself a tripod, save a bit, wait a while until you can afford something decent. Normally for weddings, lighting is very important, an additional feature. In other words, not just using natural light. It is possible again to do things just using natural light, but we want to have a more professional look to our shots. So generally you would need a strobe or a flash. You might need some kind of softbox, all depending on the situation. Often all you need is a good flash that you mount on your camera or can hold in your hand or have somebody hold or have the flash standing on a tripod. There are many options on how you're going to handle your flash, but you need to have a flash that can go off camera. That's very important so that you don't have the flash shooting straight into the bride or the bridegroom's eyes and you get the usual red eye effect. And besides the red eye effect, you get a terribly flat image. There's no dimension to it, the light's completely even, it's very unflattering. And one thing you want to do for a bride is you want to help her look as beautiful as she can be. And brides generally are beautiful when they are at their weddings with their makeup and their hair and the beautiful dress that they're wearing. Now let's give them fantastic lighting so that they can look great. So, really important as an additional piece of gear other than your camera and a tripod would be a stand for your light, a wireless trigger, stand for your flash, sorry, and a wireless trigger for your flash. And if you don't like the wireless route, you can run cables, but there are disadvantages to that at a wedding with people running around. And obviously, one would not consider an assistant as gear, so I won't call your assistant gear, but it's advisable to have an assistant when you're busy at a wedding. It's very difficult to do everything on your own and not miss shots. Now, what kind of lenses should you have with your camera for a wedding, for example, or a function? You can have fixed focal length lenses, and they normally function very well in low light. So that's a great advantage of a fixed focal length lens. However, it means you have to walk your zoom. What do I mean by that? Is if you want to fill the frame with just the head and shoulders of a subject and you've got a 50mm lens on a full frame camera, you'd have to move in quite close. And they might feel uncomfortable, like you're shoving your lens under their noses, and people don't like that. So my recommendation is to have some kind of zoom lens on your camera. On full frame cameras, a 24 to 70mm zoom is really a very useful range to be using. And if you're using a cropped sensor camera, the equivalent is more or less an 18 to 55 or so millimeter lens. That would allow you to get wide shots by zooming out. Also you can get tighter shots by zooming in, and then when you walk while using your zoom as well, you can find an ideal distance from your subject to get that tight shot that I just mentioned a moment ago, but not to be in their space and to crowd them. And that's one of the great advantages of having one of those lenses. So now, what about landscapes? Does one need a specialized lens for that? Every genre of photography does lean towards certain kinds of gear. but it's not absolutely required. One of the things in landscapes that you really would like to have is a full frame camera. It just brings out more color, it brings out more saturation in your image, brings out more detail in your image, and in a landscape you're looking for all those things, much more than you would be looking for that kind of detail, say if you were taking a portrait. A portrait, you don't want too much detail, you don't want to see every pore on a person's skin, you don't want to see every blemish on their skin. So a lens that's not as sharp, or a sensor that's not as sharp as the one that you would use for landscapes would be okay. So, full frame camera, you're probably looking for wider angled lenses most of the time. In other words, on a full frame camera, if you were using a 35mm or a 28mm or a 24mm or wider lens, you'd get a fantastic panoramic view of what you're looking at. However, there are occasions where the thing you want to shoot is far away from you, maybe near the horizon, and there's no way that you can get close to that subject. So then you would need some kind of telephoto lens. So those are ideal lenses for that kind of camera, and then naturally you would need various kinds of filters depending on the landscape you're shooting and the effect you're trying to achieve, or the problem you're trying to overcome. One's got to remember, a photographer, every time they are about to take a photograph, are dealing with potential problems that would obstruct the image, spoil the image, demand attention where it should not be. In other words, a very bright background and a very poorly lit subject in the foreground. Your eye would go to the background and you would hardly notice your real subject, which is in the foreground. So these are all little things that you'd be confronted with all the time. Other than your gear that you have to deal with yourself, obviously, as a photographer. You've got to find your subject and find a way to capture it with the correct gear. Now, lastly, I'm going to consider the wildlife photographer. What issues do they face compared to the others that I've discussed? Well, they have a real problem. Generally speaking, the subject is pretty far away. Let's consider you are out shooting and you see a lion hunt, and that's what you plan on photographing now. You want to catch that critical moment when the kill happens, which is not my style, but a lot of people like that. Okay. You would not be able to go and stand close by and get good shots for a few reasons. So, what you would need is, firstly, we're back to the camera with a good enough sensor that you're going to get lots of detail. You tend to want a lot of detail in wildlife photography. So the bigger your sensor is, the better that's going to be for you. So an ideal situation would be to have a full frame camera, otherwise a cropped sensor, again, if you wish, a Micro Four Thirds. But with the cropped sensor and the full frame sensor, you're going to get far less depth of field. And on the cropped sensor, you're going to get far less depth of field than on the Micro Four Thirds camera. So this tends to be quite important in wildlife photography, rule of thumb, because you want to make sure that your subject, the lion attacking the buck, that is in great focus, and foreground and background, if it's slightly out of focus, it's great because it helps you zoom in to that dramatic moment that you've captured on your camera. Okay, so what kind of lens would you need? Well, I've just said how important shallow depth of field is. So you're going to need a camera that can open up wide so that you can capture as much light as possible, have as little depth of field as possible, but at the same time you need a really good zoom to bring that hunt or that kill up close so that it fills the frame in your camera. The kinds of lenses these people use are really very expensive. They tend to cost 100,000 Rand to, I don't know, maybe 600,000 Rand. So that kind of photography is not for the average person. They will go, they will have really good tripods, the best you can get, the best camera they can afford. Those cameras tend to cost 100,000 Rand and more as well. And they will spend days and they'll come back over and over. It could take them a year, if not more sometimes, to get the shot that they've been dreaming of. So extreme amount of patience is required, and I think that patience is even more important than the gear. The gear will help them capture that moment, but it will not get the moment unless the photography waited for that moment to occur. So gear is so important for certain genres of photography, but the most important thing is the photographer who is willing to push themselves and struggle and wait and climb the rocks and be up at 4:30 in the morning or 11:30 at night capturing the images that they want to capture. They will be willing to sit through the night processing those images, looking for the best one that they took during the course of the event or the day. It's the photographer that is the most important element in the whole process. The photographer doesn't require great expensive gear to take photographs, but the photographer can be aided by fantastic equipment. I think that's what we've got to understand. If you give a good photographer a camera, a DSLR, a decent camera in other words, and you give them a kit lens and send them out to do a job, they will come back with great images. However, they would have just had slightly nicer images had they had the right kinds of lenses or the right kind of camera and a tripod, etc. Okay, so that's what this is all about. Let's first get ourselves started, if we are interested in photography, with the kit lens and an entry-level camera. You can achieve great photographs, you can do great photography while you learn all the skills that are necessary, and then you also learn the advantages and disadvantages of the different kinds of equipment, the functionality that you'll have with one piece of equipment and not in another, what are the pros and cons, etc. So the best way to learn is to learn the cheapest way possible, in my opinion. So get yourself cheaper equipment, get obviously the best that you can afford, go out, use it under different circumstances, push yourself to get the best possible image. When you even feel that it's not possible to get a great image, while you're learning, that is the ideal time to push yourself to try and get a great image. Go against your natural instinct and try and achieve something really remarkable, something to remember. If you don't succeed at achieving something remarkable, that's also good, because then you have learnt a number of things. One, what your limitations are. Two, what your equipment's limitations are. Therefore, you have learned something and you can move ahead and not put yourself into that position again in the future. And then you will change something to make sure that you get a better opportunity to get a good image. To watch more of my videos, click one of the links around me. Also, please remember to subscribe and to like. This is John Golden Photography. I'm John. Till next time.